You know, I'm the chaplain for the Brentwood Police Department, and sometimes I get to hang around while they're doing some investigations, like of an accident. And here's what you find out. Eyewitness testimonies aren't all that reliable. It's amazing. Well, two cars run together. Well, what kind of cars were they? Well, there's a station wagon and a minivan, and one was dark blue and green, and one was pink, and one was red, and one was blue, and there were 6 people driving. In fact, if you've ever been in a courtroom, a good defense lawyer will have the eyewitness so turned around that the eyewitness will swear they weren't even in town when the accident happened. So what the police officers have learned to do is just kind of start where we can. Can we agree that there was an intersection? Yes. Were there 2 cars there? Yes. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Was these 2 people driving? Yes. Okay. Did they run together? Yes. We have the dented fenders. Yes. Okay. They ran together. So we're just going to try to get a general feeling of that, yes, something happened, and we're going to get the stories to where, well, maybe not perfect, but good enough. Now, this is interesting for us because Luke is written to a man named Theophilus. The very first chapter of Luke's gospel, he tells us that he's writing this so that Theophilus can have a fuller understanding of the gospel that Paul is preaching, who Jesus was in his earthly ministry, what he said, what he did, and that volume 1, Luke, and volume 2, Acts, were written so that Theophilus, and by the way, that's not a real person's name, it literally means lover of God, and we think Theophilus was a Roman official or someone in the policies and processes of Rome's governance that had a measure of influence or a measure of accessibility that could have some kind of influence over those who were making decisions about Paul's life. Paul was under arrest at the time. Luke is trying to present a case to where Paul would be released and able to continue his ministry, that the gospel was no threat to the Roman Empire as such. So we have Luke saying, I have gathered as much as I can these eyewitness accounts so that you'll know what happened. And so Luke begins to tell the story, and we get frustrated because he's not a historian. Not the way you and I understand a historian. A historian gets exact facts, exact information, and drives it hard. Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941. And we know from the military records, both from those that we captured from the Japanese and from our own there at the naval base at Pearl Harbor, exactly when the first bombs went off. And if you study Pearl Harbor, you can get an exact minute-by-minute chronology of how that attack happened and how it unfolded. That's history to us. It's not history to Luke. Luke is more of a historian, and we call him the historian because he's more of a historian than, say, Mark, who doesn't even tell us about the birth of Jesus, more of a historian than John, who's a poet and who cares nothing about time. He opens the story of Jesus with the cleansing of the temple because he wants me to understand that the whole ministry of Jesus is about Jesus tearing down the barriers that keep people from knowing God. And so that's the poetic framing of John's gospel. But that it happened first or last, John said, I don't care. Here's what's important. But Luke tries to tell us, best he can, what happened. And he tells us in the 2nd chapter of his gospel. Stand with me in honor of God's word. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the whole Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone went to his own hometown to be registered. So Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. This is God's word for God's people. Hear it, believe it, and live. Let's pray together. Through the ages, through the kingdoms, and all the kings who ruled them, you brought Mary and Joseph to a little town of Bethlehem at just the right time so that Christ could be born. How we pray, oh Father, that this moment, across the ages, you have brought us to this place, and that it would be just the right time for Christ to be born in us. And we pray this in your name. Amen. Some of you are traumatized right now because you've read and reread this passage, and you've read it again, and you've realized there is no innkeeper in the story. And that bothers some of you because you played the innkeeper in the Christmas pageant when you were a kid. And now you realize he's not even in the story. You had the big moment. You were there in the cardboard inn wearing your father's bathrobe, and you walked out, shook your head vigorously, and walked back in. You had no lines, but that was your big moment. So now we have this mean, hateful, brutal innkeeper who made a pregnant woman sleep out in the barn. Boo, hiss. Not even there. We've made all that up. So some things happen when you actually read the text that make you see a little differently and scratch your head and begin to try to understand things in a different way. One of the things that bothers people who read this passage, and those people I tell you about who stay up late at night and study these things, people who stay up late at night and study this passage are totally befuddled. And what they're befuddled on is this: Quirinius was not governor of Syria while King Herod was on the throne in Judea. King Herod died in about AD 4. Quirinius became governor of Syria in about AD 6. Now, why do I say about? Because that's the way they kept time. It was about. What year was Jesus born? 0, right? All of us wanted it to be Jesus was born at 00, semicolon, 000, semicolon, 000. Click, that's when time started. You know when he was born? AD 3, BC 3, BC 3. Before Christ, 3 years. That's when he was born. How did we get there? Because the guy who did the calendar wasn't a mathematician. He messed up the dates. That's true. We know he's off by about 3 years, which means Jesus was born in BC 3, and he died in AD 30. He was crucified in AD 30. So it kind of befuddles all the dates that we want to have right. So King Herod died somewhere around AD 4. Quirinius took over Syria about AD 6. But here's things that we know. Quirinius was a well-known Roman official, and he had been viceroy, which is a different level of Roman authority in the area. So he had been in different levels of authority and rule in the birth of Jesus. So when he was officially made the governor of Syria, then that may have been later. We also know that there were a bunch of census taken this time. There were several. Mainly because Herod and Caesar Augustus were having a major falling out. Augustus was concerned about Herod's brutality. He was also concerned that maybe Herod wasn't collecting all the taxes that he should be collecting. So we even have one thing where Augustus took back the taxation from Herod and made Herod kind of change all of that. So we got all of these people registering for different kind of census. One census was you had to go swear that you were a loyal subject of King Herod and Caesar Augustus, and you had to go sign up for that. That would not have taken Joseph back to Bethlehem. So we were scratching our head, why would he go back to Bethlehem unless it was some kind of taxation, some kind of census where he had to go pay his property tax. And probably what happened was Joseph may have still owned property around Bethlehem. Maybe he had to go pay the tax, and he had to go down to the county courthouse, as you and I have to do, and pay the tax on the property. Because there was a bunch of different censuses. But what Luke is telling Theophilus is this is about where it happened. It was about when all this stuff was going on, and that's good enough. And Theophilus would have said, fine, I know when that happened, it's about here. And I keep telling you about the guide I had when we were on our tour of the Holy Land, and we would go to like the Garden of Gethsemane, and he would say, this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is where Jesus prayed. And there's always somebody on the tour who would say, hey, is this the exact spot where Jesus prayed? And our guide would always go, nah, 50 yards this way, 50 yards that way. Had you been here, you would have seen him. So dear Theophilus, year 2 here, year 2 there. Had you been there, you'd seen it. We want it to be exact. We would go, oh, well, this is just, no. Luke wouldn't have been concerned about that. This is about when it happened. That's good enough. That's close enough. And what we don't know is why Mary went with Joseph. There was no need for her to go. She was very, very pregnant. Now, I know guys have no clue about pregnancy. I understand that. But even Joseph could figure this out. You don't need a woman that pregnant on a donkey. You don't need her on the front seat of a car. She doesn't need to be traveling. When we found out that Jeannie was pregnant with twins, we went to the doctor, and we met the doctor, and he literally takes out a map. And he says, Jeannie, for the first 3 months, you can travel in this circle. For the second 3 months, you can travel in this circle. And the last 3 months, you don't travel. Joseph was at least that smart. He could look at his wife and go, maybe you don't need to go very far. Have you ever thought that maybe one of the things that was going through Joseph's mind when they're back in that stable and she's wrapping the baby and swaddling clothes is, whoosh, what would have happened if this had happened in the middle of nowhere? I'd be having to deliver this baby. I'm so glad we made it to Bethlehem. Unless it was to protect Mary. He wouldn't leave her behind to be pointed at and gossiped about and laughed at. So he took her with him to Bethlehem. Even then, he was protecting her. And so God gets Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. And you and I think, oh, that is so cool. Bethlehem is maybe the one little tiny village of all the places in the world that Jesus should be born. That is just so cool. Bethlehem is a nothing little town. Nothing. They only had a hotel built there a couple of years ago. It's been a tourist attraction for thousands of years. No hotel. You would get off the bus, staying in a hotel in Tiberias. You would drive over to Bethlehem. You would get off the bus. You would stand in line. Finally, you would get to a place, and the priest would go, this is where Jesus was born. Can you buy an ashtray on your way out? And you get back on the bus. You go to a hotel. They just got a hotel because it's a nothing little town. In fact, let me tell you how nothing. There hadn't been anything going on in Bethlehem in a couple hundred years. Their big claim to fame is that David grew up there. King David. That was a few hundred years ago. But they still had, this is where David grew up. This is where he kept his sheep. This is where he learned to work a slingshot. And no doubt you could get a tourist version of David's slingshot, and you could take that home to your kids. But it was all about David. But there had been a whole mess of history happened since then that nobody said anything about. Solomon had been king. Solomon's children had been king, the grandchildren of David. The country had been split in two, North Kingdom, South Kingdom, and you had all of that history where the nation was literally falling apart. And now they are the slaves of Rome. We would go to Bethlehem and we remember that we used to be a great nation and there used to be a great king, and we would remember what was and we would know what would never be again. So we'd go to Bethlehem and we would grieve that our nation had no future. That's why the prophecy in chapter 11 of Isaiah is so important. From the stump of Jesse, from where a great tree used to be, from the place where we would go and point and say something significant happened here, but we don't look for anything to happen anymore. From that place of despair, God announces to his people, I will start. From a stump, I'll grow a new nation. From a stump, I'll build a new kingdom. Bethlehem wasn't famous until Jesus showed up. The good thing about Bethlehem, it's a place to start. And so Jesus is born, and he's laid in a manger, probably in a cave behind the main house that would have been the inn, where the animals were kept in bad weather. That may have been the place where Joseph and Mary were kind of kept away from everybody else and kind of given some semblance of privacy to celebrate the birth of their child. It was in this little place where nobody expected anything to happen, where Jesus came. And so shepherds come and worship. No, they were not the welcoming committee. They were not the nobles of the area. They were not the high-powered politicians or the leaders of the business community. They were outsiders and strangers, and yet they're the ones who come and bow down and welcome baby Jesus to the world. This is an awful place for the king to start, we think, and we sing all these sad gospel songs. Poor little Jesus boy, I didn't know who you were. Made you lay in a manger. The only person you don't hear complain is God. It's a manger in a stable in Bethlehem. And God says, good enough. It's a great place to start. The Christmas message is not about God finishing. The Christmas message is about God starting. Over and over, you see this going on in the life and the ministry of Jesus. He doesn't wait for people to get perfect. He doesn't wait for everything to be just right. Just good enough. Just give me a place to start. So he chooses disciples. Does he get the graduates of the leading universities? PhDs, successful business people? No. 12 of the biggest losers that have ever walked the face of the earth. Good enough. And we love that because we always pick a disciple that's ours, right? He's one of us. Thomas. Thomas is one of my favorites. He's the realist of the group. When Jesus tells the disciples he has to go back to Jerusalem, it is Thomas who says, well, let's all go with him. That way we'll all die together. And it's Thomas who says to the disciples, last image I have of Jesus is his life flowing out of his body, dripping from his hands and flowing from his side as he hung there on the cross. I know how dead he was. I cannot conceive that he would be alive. I don't care what you tell me until I touch his hands and put my hand in the wound that I saw on his side, and I know it's Jesus. I can't believe. And so Jesus shows up and extends his hands, shows Thomas the wound. We have no record that Thomas ever touched him, but he fell in front of Jesus and worshiped. Even now, we don't call Thomas the believer. He's known as the doubter. Good enough. Simon Peter. We love Simon, don't we? He's the man. We always say if there was a disciple, that would be us, because we're the ones who would say to Jesus, no matter what else happens, count on us. If everybody else leaves you, we will be with you to the death. And he crumbles on the like lawn furniture. He falls apart in front of the intense interrogation of a teenage girl. Yeah, Jesus, count on me unless you really need me. And Peter starts to run. So Jesus goes and finds him. I tell you all the time, the good news of the gospel is not that you can get to Jesus, that Jesus has come to you. And so Jesus finds Simon Peter. They have breakfast together, and he asked him the question, Simon? Uh-oh. Peter knew what that meant. See, Peter had this great this great response to Jesus when Jesus said, who am I? And he said, you are the Christ. And Jesus said, that's right, but my Father revealed this to you. You didn't come to this on your own. And now you are the rock. Now you are Peter. And on you I'm going to build, on your faith, I'm going to build a church that even the gates of hell cannot prevail against. That was before the denials. Now we're back on the side, on the shore of Galilee. And it's Simon. We're back to square one. Do you love me? Yes, Lord. If you know anything, you have to know that I love you. Good enough. Not perfect. Not altogether. Good enough. A place to start. 5th chapter of Mark has several healing stories. One is about a man named Jairus, who was a religious leader. He comes to Jesus and says, my 12-year-old daughter is ill. Will you come to my house and heal her? And Jesus agrees, and they begin to go. They're interrupted. A woman pushes through the crowd. This woman had been sick for 12 years, and she says, if I can just grab hold of his garment. Because, see, there was an old kind of common tale about the clothes of holy men. That if you could just touch their clothes, that their holiness would infuse the cloth, and the cloth had some kind of power. It's almost kind of a belief in magic. It's a very, very primal, very basic understanding of faith. And so she pushes her way through this crowd, and in desperation, boy, you can see it in your imagination, she grabs hold of the tassels at the bottom of his robe, and she holds on for dear life, and she is healed. Jesus turns and says, who touched me? The disciples said, look at this crowd. Who hasn't touched you? Jesus knew who it was. He just wanted her to say. So she comes up and says, it was me. And he says, go in peace, daughter. Don't you love that? He stopped to make sure she heard him call her daughter. Your faith has made you well. Is it perfect? No. Good enough. Just looking for a place to start. Oh, Jairus? While they're standing there talking to that woman, messengers come and say, no need to come. She's dead. Jesus goes anyway. Walks into the home where the grief has started in the loss of this 12-year-old daughter. And Jesus says, don't panic. She's not dead. She's just asleep. And Mark tells us that the people laughed at him. They laughed at Jesus. Now, if I'm Jesus, I say, well, you're not going to laugh at me. You're not going to disrespect me like that. I'm leaving. Jesus doesn't. He walks over to the little girl, tells her to wake up, and she does. Perfect? No. It's a place to start. They bring a man's son to Jesus. He's been talking to the disciples, and the disciples cannot heal him, and the man is angry and frustrated because nobody can help his boy. So he begins to tell Jesus the problem, and Jesus says, listen, with God all things are possible if you believe. And the man turns around and goes, oh, I believe. And you can almost in the story see Jesus keep staring at him, wanting him to tell the truth, and finally he does. Lord, I do believe all I can. Please help my unbelief. Perfect? No. Good enough. And Jesus heals the boy. Just a place to start. Thief on the cross. His one request: remember me. No long list of confessions of all the things that he had done wrong. No statement about who he believed Jesus to be. Just one simple request: don't forget me. Remember me. Perfect? No, not at all. Good enough. A place for Jesus to start. You know, right now, we're driving ourselves nuts trying to make sure Christmas is perfect. Christmas has to be perfect. And if you are the host or the hostess, then you are just manic right now trying to make sure everything is perfect. What about the decorations? What will the kids be wearing? What sweater goes with what? Because when we take that Norman Rockwell picture, everybody's got to look good. And we're going to have that picture, and we're going to be all smiling if I have to beat every one of you. Who's cooking what? I don't know. Please don't let her cook that. She never cooks it right. Oh, but it has to be perfect. Never is. There's always the kid who turns over the drink. Always the uncle who opens up the wrong package. It's good enough. Just a place to start. Hear me. The good news of Christmas is not that Jesus is finished, but he's just looking for a place to start. The good news of Bethlehem is it gave Jesus a place to start. We keep fooling ourselves thinking that, well, I'll follow Jesus. But first, I have to fix all of this. Look at these mistakes I have made. When I fix these mistakes, then I will come to follow Jesus. Thing is, you never finish, do you? There's always one more mistake. There's always one more thing to do. There's always one more hanging chad in your life that you have to pay attention to. You say to yourself, look at my heart, Mike. This is what happened. This is what people did to me. And I'm angry. And my anger has turned cold. And now I am bitter. Let me release this anger. Let me deal with it. And then I will come to Jesus. And like so many times in the South, we're always fixing to get ready. We just never do. Jesus is not asking that you be perfect. He's not asking that you have it all together. He's asking for a place to start. Mike, look at my life. It's all messed up. It's crowded with all of this junk, I know. Maybe it's so crowded that Jesus will have to move into the stable of your own life. But the good news of Bethlehem is God the Father was delighted for Jesus to have a place to start. The good news of Christmas is not that Jesus finished, but that Bethlehem was the place where he came to start. This morning, the only thing the Father wants in your life and mine is simply a place to start.